Chapter 6. London, Past School for Young Ladies. Parr was one of the oldest and most respected schools in England, having been formed in 1548 by Catherine Parr, last Queen and subsequent widow of King Henry VIII. Queen Catherine, a scholar herself, had believed her intellect had kept her head secured to her neck. Parr stood in the same spot as it had for over 500 years, and continued to turn out some of the finest minds of their time, both in the world of arts and academia. Monica Phelps, now Meadows by deed poll, was sat in front of her computer, her hands held still, 2 inches above her keyboard. She was a striking girl, tall at 21 years of age, with short cropped hair and large dark eyes the colour of sloes, a pretty nose and full lips, which she'd inherited from her Ecuadorian mother. She had to be certain about what she was about to do, because there'd be no chance to placate their father after. She risked the exposure of her beloved brother, Rika, if she didn't get this right. If their father even suspected his whereabouts, he'd kill him instantly. They'd grown up in a muted existence alongside an extremely dangerous psychopath. The only thing she'd salvaged was her ability to spot crazy when she saw it. Rika had appeared one day, a baby in a bassinet. She'd been 3 and remembered it clearly, because his arrival had stifled sound, spontaneity, and smiles. The house had been unusually quiet for days. Days had turned to weeks. The adults then seemed to relax. The months had turned into years, but still her father had always eyed him with suspicion. As they'd never experienced a father-child relationship with him, they'd clung to the love their mother offered. Recalling how close they'd been left a tightness in her chest. She frowned as she re-examined the precautions they'd had to take after their father had murdered their mother in a fit of rage and then attempted the same end for them. There'd been a visitor that day who'd saved them both, Mr. Baxter. If he hadn't stepped in and fought her father off, she squeezed her eyes shut at the memory. Her father had been sent to prison, but not for long enough. Their home had subsequently been systematically taken apart by forensics. A fraudulent birth certificate had been found, with her brother's full name appearing as Rika Aons Phelps. Monica had somehow assumed her brother's full name was Ricardo, and it had been shortened to Rika. That wasn't the case, and she'd no idea he'd even possessed a second name. Its significance remained buried in the past. She'd been sent away to Parr, and for many months hadn't known what had become of Rika, until finally he'd sent word. He was staying with friends. He was okay. She was not to contact him unless it was a matter of life or death, and to trust him. Monica had been heartbroken, but she'd obeyed his wishes. However, that hadn't stopped her from tracking him down. Her only solace was keeping an eye on him via her computer, and over the years she'd become incredibly proficient at the art of espionage. Monica and Rika would always be in Baxter's debt. Hadn't she followed Baxter as best she could over the years? Her surveillance of him had lessened to the point where she only logged on occasionally to update his file. She felt for him in his isolation. She could relate to that. Then a little over a year ago, she'd logged in and had been unable to trace his whereabouts. He'd fallen off the grid. His last known address had been a house in Manhattan. She'd finally checked all the morgues with John Doe's, drawing a blank. Then something unexpected had happened 6 months ago, while she'd been watching the news. She'd had to rewind as her mind stalled at a man raising his collar and entering La Amethyst. Something familiar about him struck a chord. The news article was about some luminary trying to avoid the public eye as they ascended those illustrious steps. She'd frozen the best image she could and had walked about her room for 5 minutes before turning back to the screen, her perspective now acutely sharper. It was Baxter. She breathed a mental sigh of relief. She'd found him. Today Monica graduated from PAR. She felt both relieved and excited. The ceremony would be held in the grounds of that venerable establishment. It was a sunny day, and the podium and chairs had been set out in the quadrant. PAR graduates were flapping around, smiling, talking animatedly, and were in good spirits. Their families and loved ones would be arriving to coo over their achievements. She didn't need any of that, she reminded herself. Head teachers were moving through the throng, taking notes next to names of those pupils who would be leaving with parents to attend some celebratory lunch. Monica wasn't going anywhere. No one was coming for her. Within the hour, they'd all sat and dutifully stood, one by one to collect their degrees and accolades, to clapping and general good wishes. In the furthest corner on the second story, behind a mullioned window, stood Rika, looking through binoculars, a large smile on his face. As she descended the podium, her intuitive eye fell on a man. He was smartly dressed, somewhere in his 40s, with close-cropped hair. She didn't recognize him, but there was something about his clapping that had drawn her attention, or perhaps she had just imagined it. She'd been making her way to the back of the crowd as hats were thrown in the air to whoops of joy. Turning to look back, she felt someone at her elbow. It was the man she'd observed. "Nice day for it," he commented casually, taking a sip from a champagne flute. She was on her guard. Something about him was alerting her to remain unemotional. It was the suppressed excitement behind his eyes which warned her. "Yes," she replied innocently. She was about to move away when he added, "I'm the second guest. Distant uncle. Haven't seen her since she was an infant. Not sure where to put myself, to be honest, as she didn't recognize me." The man gave a nervous laugh, which she felt was just for effect. "Excuse me?" she queried. "Michelle Ortega. I'm her uncle. Well, distant uncle. The name is Dreadnought. Harry Dreadnought." Her eyes expertly scanned those assembled for the shy and retiring Michelle. She saw her sitting next to a woman of generous proportions, who had to be her mother, because her every other gesture involved hugging and kissing her. "They're over there, if you're looking for them." She mistakenly allowed the question to hang in the air. Dreadnought had been made, and he knew it. What did the Titans want with her? As they stared at one another, she quickly attempted to tip the scales in her defence by smiling as if her remark had been entirely innocent. His ability to extrapolate information from every readable source meant he'd already began mentally recording. "Where are your family?" he asked, looking out over the guests, curious as to how she'd reply. "I don't have any family that can attend." She knew she was being interrogated by this man and was only one step ahead of him. She didn't know why, only that she instinctively felt there was something dangerous about him, which meant he would instantly recognize a lie. Honesty? He couldn't be certain if it was truth or self-preservation on her part. Her file gave no mention of family. He recognized she was spatially cognizant. She's prime Titan grist, he thought. He decided to test his theory. I apologize. I didn't mean to pry." He offered her his most conciliatory smile, which she matched perfectly. "It's fine." She purposefully allowed a little sorrow to mirror in her eyes. The years spent with her father had made her adept at disguising her true feelings. "They've missed a great day," he stated, taking another sip from his glass. "Yes, they have," she smiled, trying not to show any emotion other than indifference. He turned slowly towards her, saying, "Family members are becoming rarer to come by these days." He couldn't be sure, but he felt her use of the word "they" had been used in its literal term. "There's just the one," she lied, and realized she was undone. "I see," he confirmed slowly. He knew she was lying, which meant her file had an unexplainable omission. She'd just confirmed there was someone, possibly more than one. Who was she keeping hidden? "I should be getting back to give my congratulations and say goodbye. It's been an enlightening day." She watched him wend through the crowds to the side of Michelle and bend down and say something, stand and walk towards the exit. She knew he equated to life or death. She'd been right in contacting Rika, asking him to get in touch. If, as she believed, her father was trying to make a connection to her through Dreadnought, she'd cut him down without compunction. She'd instantly recognized he was dangerous, even unhinged. Of course Dreadnought was her father's lackey. They were cut from the same psychotic cloth. Dressed in a black suit, befitting past porters, Mr. Phelps had specifically kept his distance from his daughter. On this occasion, he hadn't been able to stop himself from attending her graduation ceremony. Upon first seeing her after such a long interval, he'd been taken aback by how tall she'd grown. When she'd ascended the podium, he'd experienced a hitherto unfelt swell of pride, momentarily puzzling at its presence. He'd saved his daughter by being absent from her life. As she collected her degree and begun to descend the steps, she'd hesitated. Amidst the ensuing applause, someone was deliberately clapping out of sync. Scanning the guests, he'd immediately honed in on the man unknown to him and clearly out of place. Mr. Phelps recognized a fellow top predator when he saw one. The man was too fit, too lean, too hungry-looking. He immediately pegged him as ex-military, ex-mercenary, and currently owned by an organization whose leash restrained an inherent nature for violence. That could be easily determined by the way he expertly circumnavigated the parental herd, stalking his daughter until he'd ambushed her. Phelps hadn't hesitated. He'd already taken one flight of stairs up to the roof of Par after stripping off his jacket and tie. Once on the roof, he laid down, elbowing forward towards the edge to get a better view. Picking up his rifle, he focused its sight on the man, whose profile he could clearly see through this telescopic lens. With his trained eye, he could decipher from the man's body language that he was inordinately interested in what Monica was saying and that she was guarded in her response to him. As the man had walked away, he'd watched how she scrutinized his movements. So the apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. Clever girl, he thought. Quickly moving away from the edge of the roof, he rose. Dismantling his rifle with astonishing speed, he snapped its case shut and was off the roof in pursuit of him.